These slides give a pictorial history of Parihaka, the community, its people, and their struggle over the last century. The full story of Parihaka is better told elsewhere. It is a complex and difficult tale, but through the eyes of the artists and photographers of the last 100 years, we can perhaps see and feel more what it was like to be associated with this place and its destiny. To understand what gave rise to Parihaka as a community, we need to know something of the times that gave it birth.
The early 1800s, and the time when New Zealand was colonised, mostly by Europeans from the British Isles. Taranaki was a prize area, rich, fertile bush, plenty of rivers, a land easily converted to British agriculture and grazing. With the new settlers came the clash of two wholly different cultures and value systems, and this conflict was particularly evident over attitudes on the ownership and use of the land. There were disputes between the Maori people, some wanting to sell land to Pākehā settlers, some wanting to retain the land in common tribal ownership. There were disputes between Maori and Pākehā, as the pressure for more land was increased. The government, seen here netted in the middle, didn't fail to make political or economic advantage over the situation. There were many isolated clashes, such as this one when Waitara women chased a team of surveyors off their land. Inevitably, war broke out, and the Taranaki Maoris, although they fought strongly, didn't really stand a chance in the face of the military hardware of the new settlers. The community of Parihaka arose out of these war years. Its prophetic leaders established the village as a place of peace amidst these violent times. It was not a fortified pa, nor were there any weapons of war allowed within the village. It was founded on Christian principles, but principles that went hand in hand with Maori values and the Maori approach towards life.
Te Whiti o Rongomai is perhaps the best known of the two prophetic leaders. It said that he wouldn't allow any photographs of himself to be taken during his lifetime, and this sketch was scribbled by a post office teller on his shirt cuff while Te Whiti was addressing a meeting, and later was redrawn and distributed to the newspapers of the day. Te Whiti was a prophet in the correct sense of the word. He had an intimate knowledge of the Bible as well as the esoteric wisdom of his own people. He was a seer and a healer, and had exceptional skill as an orator in weaving spiritual thought with the political and social needs of his time. Much of Te Whiti's youth was spent in the community at Warea, where he attended the mission station run by Raymond Snyder, and later directed the running of the Maori-owned flour mill. During the wars, however, Warea was shelled from the sea, and the Maori community dispersed to Parihaka. Tohu Kakahi was the other prophetic figure, and his role in the leadership of Parihaka has been underplayed in previous historical accounts. Both Te Whiti and Tohu shared the leadership of the people, according to their different talents. Te Whiti was recognized as the spokesman, while Tohu took command in the field. They were both closely related, although about the same age. Tohu was known as the uncle of Te Whiti o Rongomai. Although Tohu was not known so much as an orator, his spiritual influence on the people was no less than that of his partner. He also had a recognized gift of spiritual mediumship, from which he drew a lot of his guidance.
The early village of Parihaka was literally carved out of the bush, most of the houses being built in the traditional style with materials on hand. This was the first European-styled house on the marae. Called Miti Mai Te Arero, lick the tongue towards the speaker, it was used as a dining and reception centre by the prophets. Photography had only recently been invented at the time of these photos, and the originals of these slides are from the large glass plate negatives used at the time. The houses were built very close together, with smaller shelters used as cooking huts, and some, like in the front of this photo, were buried into the ground for food storage. These photos were taken just before the sacking of the village in 1881, when there were about 3,000 people living there, making it one of the largest Maori settlements in the country. A cookhouse, with the woman posing in the front, scraping potatoes with a shell.
The prophets wouldn't allow traditional carvings and rafter patterns to be used at Parihaka. Their teachings were trying to reflect a new symbolism, and the ornaments on the houses reflected the changing thought of the time. This is one such example. A native owl is being chased by a Pākehā cat. The religious teachings of the new community revolved around an obedience to the will of God, as interpreted by the prophets, the principles of pacifism and peace coupled with the active practice of goodwill. The prophet summed this up by quoting the Bible's Christmas invocation, sung at the birth of Christ. Glory to God on high, peace on earth, and goodwill towards all men. The Parihaka followers wore te raukura, the white feathers of the albatross, which symbolized this Christmas message.
The peace following the wars was not an easy peace for the Maori. There had been many attempts by the government to bribe the chiefs around Taranaki to part with their tribal land, or demoralise the warriors with gut-rot whisky. The influence of the Parihaka prophets prevented this. They drew wide support, including that from many tribes that were bitter enemies only a generation beforehand. People came to Parihaka from as far as the Ngāpuhi lands of the north and the Chatham Islands in the south. In some cases, whole sub-tribes packed up and moved to the new village of peace. When they arrived, each tribal group was given an area of their own in which they built their own meeting houses and cooking facilities. The Maori king sent 12 apostles to live at Parihaka as a living link between the two movements. As well as drawing people to live there, Parihaka was a great attraction for its meetings, held on the 18th of each month. Huge parties of travellers would journey to the marae for the major gatherings held in March and September. They became the focal point for the religious and political expression of the community, and proceedings were watched and reported on with great interest by the government agents in the area. Here's another obviously posed photograph. You don't notice it at first, but the man in the background is carrying a shovel. He is Noho, the son of Te Whiti.
The peace being preached at Parihaka certainly wasn't shared by the young nation as a whole. The continuing Maori refusal to release more land for sale only embittered the government and leading settlers at the time. A cartoon from an 1860s Taranaki Punch. To make things worse, the government was experiencing a financial depression, and the sale of the Taranaki plains was seen as an opportune step to help the economy. This was the man to do the job, John Bryce, a leading Whanganui landowner and aggressive politician who held the office of Minister of Native Affairs. Another cartoon of the day, Bryce stoking up the fire of Parihaka against the advice of Punch that it will soon boil over. In the face of increasing pressure, the Parihaka prophets sent out teams of ploughmen to symbolically plough disputed land. This is the campaign as seen by the British newspapers, a scene drawn at Jury's farm in Te Korangi. Te Whiti said that he was not merely ploughing the land, he was ploughing the mana of the government so that they would come to Parihaka and talk. At first the government wouldn't arrest the ploughmen for fear of another war, and this was a situation that so incensed local settlers that at Hāwera they declared themselves a republic. This man, James Livingstone, was elected as its first president.
The arrests did take place, several hundred of them, both in the plowing campaign and a later campaign when the Parihaka Mares erected fences across newly surveyed roads which cut across cultivations. There was no resistance offered to the arrests. The caption to this picture describes the fences in New Plymouth Courthouse accepting 2 years hard labour with the most perfect indifference. A bill was rushed through Parliament allowing the government to keep the prisoners in custody without trial. Despite international criticism, they were held in custody, mainly in South Island jails, for a couple of years. This is a relic from those prison days, a bone-carved pendant with their crime inscribed on its side. The government set up a royal commission to investigate the land dispute. It recommended the prisoners be released, which they were at the beginning of 1881. But this was not the end of the matter. The prevailing settler view was that the best course of action to secure the Taranaki lands would be a quick, decisive war. Te Whiti's speeches to his people were widely reported, and in many cases misinterpreted to suggest that Parihaka was preparing for battle. Native Minister Bryce succeeded in convincing the government to mount a large force to march on Parihaka and quash the rebels. The majority of settlers in the colony rejoiced at the prospect of another Maori war. Here a party of volunteers from Littleton are being given a civic farewell. Troops were called up from all over the country, as this notice records, and still more volunteers were enlisted to accommodate those who protested at being left out of the glory. This is the Taranaki Mounted Rifles at Oyo, having rifle practice. And a page from Captain Newell's notebook, showing the deployment of the attacking forces around the marae.
We don't have any photographs of the march on the village, but plenty of the soldiers parading themselves before the expected battle. In all, there were over 2,500 men in arms at the gates of Parihaka. The community, in the face of this siege, refused to show any signs of animosity. To the contrary, they baked bread for the soldiers and pulled the stumps out of the way, so that the Nelson artillery could bring up their Armstrong gun. John Bryce led the invasion, symbolically on a white horse, and was met by Parihaka's front-line troops, children playing on the road, skipping and singing Christian psalms. A complete press blackout was ordered of the occasion, but 2 reporters managed to get into the village and were given a whare by Tohu, from which to view the proceedings. One of these men later recorded.
In a large square at the entrance of the pa, about 100 young girls were amusing themselves with skipping ropes, and some hundreds of boys were gathered awaiting the arrival of the soldiers with great glee. I noticed, however, among the adults, the women particularly, there was a prevailing sadness, as if they felt a great calamity was approaching. Their attempt to reply to a joke and a bit of chaff was piteously feeble. The whole spectacle was saddening in the extreme. This was an industrious, law-abiding, moral and hospitable community, calmly awaiting the approach of the men sent to rob them of everything dear to them.
This is the view the soldiers would have seen when they reached the village. The people of Parihaka had been gathered with the prophets since dawn, sitting peacefully on the marae. To this warlike gathering, Bryce read the Riot Act. Te Whiti and Tohu were arrested and offered no resistance. On the marae, the people continued to sit peacefully. Bryce ordered the people who did not originally belong to Parihaka to leave. They continued to sit in silence. This continued until the Armstrong gun was dragged up a nearby hill in front of the gathering. It was turned on the people and they were given a last chance to leave, but the order expired without anyone leaving the marae. The gun was never fired. In the days that followed, the soldiers forced those followers who were not of Taranaki origin to leave Parihaka. Their homes were demolished and burnt. There were many cases of assault, looting, and the destruction of crops. Here the houses of the Whanganui supporters have been demolished. For the soldiers, however, The glamour of a victorious march quickly faded as they settled into the routine of an occupying force. A painting of the armed constabulary orderly room, and some occupation drawings by a private ledger, women collecting kangawai or kangapiro or fermented corn from a creek, and a party of children performing a haka for the troops.
Meanwhile, Te Whiti and Tohu were tried and sent to the South Island for 2 years in what was described as an honourable captivity. They were assigned a personal warder and given a grand tour of the South Island. Such an honourable captivity was not reserved, however, for the famous warrior chief Te Tokowaru, who had also joined the prophets. He was roughly handled and went on a hunger strike, but abandoned it when he was threatened with force feeding. He spent 6 months in jail before he was released. While the prophets travelled in the South Island, they were allowed to keep their monthly observances of the 18th. This is one house in Dunedin where such meetings were held, and continued by local followers until the First World War. This portrait of Te Whiti was made in the South Island. There are conflicting opinions as to whether it was permitted or not. It is actually painted over a photograph, and in the original picture, Te Whiti was wearing a bowler hat, the rim of which you can still see in the portrait.
The 2 years in captivity didn't quell the spirit of the prophets. They returned to a people ever more willing to follow their guidance, and they started to rebuild the community, this time incorporating the new ideas of the Pākehā, much of which was influenced by the South Island tour. The house Miti Mai Tarara was rebuilt, and to support it a spectacular twin-gabled dining room was built, called Te Niho te Atiawa, the teeth of the Atiawa. And on the other side of the marae, Tohu engaged the help of a Pākehā builder to furnish an ornate 2-storied meeting house called Rangikapuia, draw the people together. The rebuilding of the village astounded many of the Pākehā visitors at the time. There was a public bakery which sold bread to surrounding settlers as well as to the village itself, an abattoir, a modern water supply running from a reservoir, and the streets were swept clean. And to add to this, Parihaka became one of the first places in the country to have street lighting. You can just see one of the lamps above the thatched roofs on the left of this picture. This building was to become famous in early settler accounts. The Parihaka Bank, where funds were collected from communal work and saved for the day of emergence, which the prophets foretold would come in the future.
While Parihaka rebuilt, however, disputes over land continued to flare around Taranaki. In 1886, about 500 Maoris moved onto disputed land near Hawera and set up a squatters' camp of tree fern and raupo whares. The constabulary were called in and arrests made, which included Te Tokowaru and Te Whiti, who spent 3 months in jail in Wellington. Later, when 30-year leases on Maori land were being converted into perpetual titles by settlers, Parihaka sent out more of its ploughmen to reassert ownership. They received much the same results as in earlier efforts. 126 men sent to jail for 2 months. These are photos of their heroes' return to Parihaka, poi teams welcoming the ploughmen onto the marae, and a hongi line-up before the speech-making. Perhaps 50 years of constant change and pressures on Parihaka finally took its tolls as feelings of resentment began to turn within. The prophets had a dispute between themselves in 1890, and thereafter lived on separate parts of the marae. Their followers living at Parihaka also split their support. The Te Whiti followers kept their feather emblem and became known as the Rau-Kupa people. Tohu's supporters refused to wear the feathers and became known as the Pore people, the people without horns. Things continued to change on the face of the marae, and despite the split between the leaders, huge monthly meetings continued to be held, like this gathering in 1896. The figure in front is the chief Te Whiti, prominent in the earlier Waitara Wars. While in prison in Wellington, Te Whiti was visited by this man, Tare Waitara, They became friends, and Waitara returned with the prophet to Parihaka and married his daughter, Naroaki Pereni. Waitara became the main organizer of the Rau-Kupa followers. This is their committee of management. And with the help of a good deal of Waitara's private capital, this huge meeting house was built on the raised marae. Called Te Rau-Kupa, it had a large meeting room capable of holding several hundred people. The small cottage in the middle of the two larger houses was Te Whiti's private quarters. The large house on the left housed the bakery and the Waikato apostles. A close-up shows the marae with speeches in progress.
This is the interior of the Niho dining room, an immaculate setting wherein male waiters carved meat at the head of the three long tables. Te Whiti's son Noho Mairangi sits with his family and friends, and some of the constant flow of Pākehā visitors to the community. The teachings of the prophets were recorded and propagated through the chants and action songs of the Parihaka Poi teams. In the early days of the plowing campaigns, the Poi songs embodied the political and spiritual messages of the prophets and animated the speech-making on the marae. Some of these songs are still sung today at the annual Maui Pomare celebrations at Waitara. This is the Parihaka Fife and Drum Band. And the Puniho Brass Band.
Tohu Kakahi died in February 1907. He'd been bedridden for the last 5 years of his life following a fall in which he damaged his thigh. Mourners of the day recollect a canoe-shaped cloud carrying the figure of a man form over the marae and remain in the sky for the 7 days that his body lay in state. Te Whiti Rongomai died soon after, in November 1907. He was believed to be 90 years of age. News of his death and remembrance of his struggle drew many to his tangi. His body would have been lying in the small tent in front of Te Rau-Kupa. His tomb was erected over the site where the original house, Miti Mai Te Arero, once stood. The words on his memorial stone repeating the philosophical invocation of glory, peace and goodwill.
At the time of their deaths, the influence of the prophets were already clearly beginning to fade. The 20th century began to encroach on the way of life at Parihaka. This is 1915. The arrival of the motorcar at a tangi in the early 20s. This photograph gives a good view of Tohu's house, Rangikapuia, with its elaborate fretwork. Unfortunately, most of the timber used in these early constructions was untreated and the buildings easily deteriorated. This is the restoration of Rangikapuia, a novel method of putting boards in the outside and pouring concrete in between. The restored house was reopened in 1927 as a memorial to Tohu and his teachings. That same year, a royal commission reported on the legality of Maori confiscated lands, and it supported the stand of the prophets and the Parihaka people. No land was returned, however, but a trust board was set up which could administer compensation payments from the government. But compensation could not restore the community spirit to Parihaka and its people. Times had changed too much. War, a depression, and unemployment soon reduced the village of peace into a ghost town. The monthly holy days still continue to be observed on the marae, and each November an annual feast called the Pahua is held. This feast commemorates the deeds of the prophets in maintaining peace in the face of the march on Parihaka in 1881. It is a time for traditional Maori food served on the floor of Rangikapuia. August 1960 saw perhaps the saddest chapter in the demise of Parihaka. The large meeting house Te Raukura was consumed by fire, taking with it one of the last orators in the Te Whiti tradition.
But with the physical demise of the community, the spiritual influence of Parihaka began to live in a totally different way. The irrepressible struggle was put into print by author Dick Scott. Scott's researches were mainly compiled from Pākehā archives, but also included oral histories from elders such as Hororo Horehoka. In his later edition of the book, renamed Ask That Mountain, Scott began to capture the imagination of a generation who had never been taught at school of the land disputes in the last century. The Parihaka story has also been captured in a play by the late Maori journalist and race relations conciliator Harry Danzy. At Parihaka itself, the old dining room of Te Niho has been restored and converted into a new meeting house which will stand as a memorial to the permanent values behind the Parihaka struggle. Working bees began on this in Christmas 1967, and when completed, the elders symbolically gave the key of the house to the students and teachers of the world. In 1979, Maori artist Selwyn Muru exhibited a series of paintings which illustrated the Parihaka story and conflicts of the last century.
And today at Parihaka, the holy days and the annual feasts still continue, but joining with them are the continual flow of modern pilgrimages. School children, craft groups, weddings, tangis, and family reunions. And the marae continues to be a venue for those who continue the debate of Maori land. Perhaps the prophets of 100 years ago could not imagine Taranaki today, or what their story would mean to the present generation. But as the land remains, Parihaka too remains. And their prophetic example of non-violence and goodwill will never really leave us.